In the waning days of the Reich, German soldiers still clung to a steadfast belief. They had the KAR98K, the bolt-action rifle regarded as a symbol of unmatched power. They were convinced that the American conscript could never compare. But soon enough a brutal truth emerged. The semi-automatic M1 Garand, carried by every US soldier, turned the battlefield into a wall of steel, leaving the Germans stunned. From the mud walls of 1918 to the training grounds of 1940, the silhouette of the German soldier hardly changed. They grew up with the same discipline, the same rifles, the old Mauser bloodline flowing through the years, crystallized in the Karabiner 98K. The wooden stock wore down with time, but the feeling of just right did not. Lift, aim, squeeze the trigger, and again lift, pull back. A rhythm that became instinct. The KAR98K was the direct descendant of the Mauser 1898. The entire design family was built on one simple, enduring belief. The first shot had to be accurate. Every round was a promise. To achieve that, the action had to be solid, the barrel durable, the bolt as secure as a steel door. That is why the KAR98K remained loyal to the manual bolt action system. After the shot cracked, the rifleman lifted, pulled back, pushed forward, locked down. 4 movements, repeated like the tolling of a clock. A skilled soldier could keep that rhythm at about 15 rounds a minute, carefully aimed, steady, just enough. On the training field, the KAR98K's strengths stood out clearly. Crystal clear sights, a clean trigger, a stout frame that conveyed confidence into the shoulder. One sharp kick and then silence. At long range, it offered the craftsman's satisfaction. Adjust the sight, control the breath, hold the squeeze until the firing pin struck home, and then a neat, concise crack. Long-distance drills, strict training regimens, and the squad leader's praise all reinforced a conviction. This was the German soldier's standard. But war does not always wait patiently at 300 meters, under clear skies, with a gentle wind. From Warsaw to Paris and onto the gates of Moscow, German tactics revolved around the MG42, the steel grinder that spat fire, while the men with KAR98KS stood around it like a shield. Their duty? Protect, feed ammunition, keep rhythm for the squad's heart. When the MG42 roared, everything else receded. The KAR98K, accurate as it was, became background, steadying the ground so the main gun could do the rest. In the field, the weakness appeared exactly where the strength had once been praised. Every lift-pull-push lock created a gap in the line of fire. And in that gap, time was no longer measured in seconds, but in the rain of sparks from the opposing trench. The soldier heard the metal scrape as the bolt cycled, a sound far too long when the enemy across the line had no need for it. In narrow trenches, at broken angles, in sudden assaults, the handcrafted rhythm of the KAR98K began to falter. An arm numbed by the cold fog meant the pull was no longer smooth. Thickened oil slowed the bolt a beat, and sometimes one beat was everything. Training remained strict. The shooting remained precise. But where firepower allowed no silence, the accuracy of a single shot grew lonely. The soldier worked the bolt again, while the trench shuddered from an explosion somewhere beyond sight. On paper, a skilled marksman could hold 15 rounds a minute. On the battlefield, a single minute could demand 3 changes of position, 2 dives into the dirt, and 1 life-or-death decision. In that moment, every extra movement was a gamble. In the standard squad diagram, the doctrine spelled it out bluntly. Rifles, like the KAR98K, did not lead the assault. They held the line so the machine gun could work. That doctrine carried German troops far, but the farther they went, the more they collided with close combat terrain, with thick hedgerows, with houses, with sudden corners, places where sustained fire was no longer an option, but a condition for survival. The obsolescence did not come because the KAR98K was inferior. It wasn't. and that must be said fairly. It belonged to another era, one where the perfect shot was king. The new era demanded something else, a stream of fire. Not one precise answer, but an unbroken chain of answers. Not a steel pen carving elegantly on glossy paper, but an engine running all night without pause. A rifle, accurate and proud, yet trapped in the past. Meanwhile, across the ocean, a new weapon was ready to rewrite the rules of war. On a Massachusetts morning in the 1930s, a thin layer of snow covered the yard of the armory. Inside the workshop, John Cantius Garand stood by the test bench, his eyes intent. He wasn't searching for a weapon reserved for a select few. He was trying to design a rhythm of fire, steady, repeatable, reliable, that every infantryman could carry onto the battlefield. With each test, he leaned in to catch the sound of metal locking and unlocking, adjusted the spring, changed the angle of the gas port. No philosophy, no slogans, just a single question: how can a soldier pull the trigger once and let the mechanism take care of the rest? The answer lay in the gas-operated semi-automatic system. The blast from the cartridge drove a piston assembly through its cycle, ejecting the spent case, chambering the next round, locking the bolt, returning the rifle to ready. No more four-step bolt manipulation, no more empty gaps between shots. In a soldier's hands, Garand turned a single squeeze of the trigger into a continuous stream of fire. When the 8-round en bloc clip emptied, a sharp metallic ping rang out, then a fresh clip was pressed down and the latch snapped shut. In just seconds, shorter than a deep breath, the line of fire was restored. On the firing range, the difference could be heard and seen. The shots ticked off like a second hand sweeping smoothly around the dial. The soldier no longer needed to lift his head from the sights to work the mechanism. The stock stayed firm against the shoulder, the eye fixed on the target, the right hand doing only one thing, squeezing the trigger. In a minute of real combat, the Garand's rhythm could far surpass the approximately 15 rounds per minute even a seasoned KAR98K marksman could manage. The 30-006 Springfield bullet left the barrel trailing a thin jet of flame. It carried the same raw energy as Germany's powerful rifle cartridges, but it was the way it was delivered, continuous, controlled, with few interruptions, that changed the balance. A four-man team with Garands could hold the head of a street, push back small probing attacks, cover comrades as they crossed open ground. The mobile point of fire was no longer a metaphor. It was what they actually did: suppress, maneuver, suppress again, without waiting for a machine gun to set up its tripod. At Springfield Armory, the technical story became an industrial one. Assembly lines carried rifle receivers through nearly 1,000 steps. Specialized machines broke tasks down so finely that a new worker, trained for just a few weeks, could step into place and repeat every motion precisely. As a result, every Garand component, from bolt assemblies to rear sights, could be swapped between rifles without a craftsman's hand fitting them by eye. What the other side had dismissed as impossible to mass-produce became the daily standard here. The numbers, usually dry, suddenly pulsed with rhythm. In 1943, Springfield and Winchester turned out more than 4,000 rifles every day. By January 1944, the factory clock kept time to an astonishing tempo: 122,001 rifles in a single month, roughly 3,936 a day, 164 every hour. Each shift whistle was like another wave of fire sent forward. And the numbers weren't alone. Behind them stood uniformity, reliability, the ability to keep rifles firing in mud, cold, sand, or wind. That advantage carried straight into training. On the drill fields, recruits learned the Garand quickly. They moved across obstacle courses, firing as they advanced with the precise technique of marching fire: step, aim, squeeze, their buddies moved up, then step, squeeze again. Training reports noted sharply reduced time to proficiency compared to the bolt-action era. Qualification rates soared and more soldiers reached expert marks when the army switched to semi-automatics. Not because they were careless, but because the mechanism allowed quick recovery from mistakes, sustained pressure, and calmer focus when they no longer had to break aim to work a bolt. Technical advantage brought tactical advantage. The American squad no longer had to revolve around a single barrel. When they hit a sudden corner, the two men in front laid down fire with the steady rhythm of the Garand, while the other two slipped past to establish a new firing point. Then the roles switched. In the cold night, heavy gloves still worked the trigger. When gun oil thickened, the gas system kept cycling smoothly. The price of a pause between shots no longer had to be paid. From the docks to the front lines, the Garand followed the path of an industrial democracy, the best for all, not reserved for a few. And so, when General George S. Patton wrote on January 26, 1945, that this was the greatest battle implement ever devised, he was not praising just a design. If the KAR98K was the voice of tradition, beautiful, rounded, but solitary, the Garand was the soundscape of modernity. And when the two worlds met in North Africa and Normandy, the gap between two shots would no longer be a technical detail. It would be the distance between the man who advanced and the one who fell behind. The desert wind stretched the horizon into a trembling line. Beneath the blinding white sky, a German platoon crouched behind a rocky outcrop, breathing hard. Across the way, fine plumes of dust rose, then the black silhouettes of American soldiers flickered with small bursts of flame, steady, close, without pause. The sound was unlike anything they had heard before, not the roar of a machine gun, not the halting bang, pause, bang of bolt-action rifles. It was a seamless metallic rhythm, like the sweep of a second hand gliding around a clock without stopping at each mark. A German sergeant lifted his head for a quick glance, his hand still poised on the bolt handle. He caught sight of oiled rifles gleaming in enemy hands, black stocks pressed tight to shoulders, the shooters hardly shifting their gaze from the sights. He pulled, pushed, locked. On the other side, the American's shoulder gave a small jolt, the barrel dipped and rose again, and the rhythm of fire answered instantly to every move. The Germans tried to change position. Each time they raised their heads, a chain of sparks drove them flat into the sand. The gap between two shots became the open slit through which enemy rounds poured. On the flat desert, with no cover, there was no room left for wasted motion. Kasserine burned into memory, like a page scorched by the sun. After the battle, in a makeshift tent, staff officers opened their notebooks. Hasty lines of handwriting. U.S. infantry employs semi-automatic rifles in large numbers, sustained fire while advancing, difficult to approach their firing points. The script wavered in places, as though the writer himself was hearing something he wasn't yet ready to believe. The report was sent back to Berlin. A bright room, tall windows, walls covered with maps. News from the desert passed through many hands. The final note was cold. Possible confusion with Thompson submachine guns, mass production of semi-automatic rifles in numbers as reported is not feasible. A red pencil underlined the words, "not feasible." A decision on paper denying a sound that echoed across the desert. Meanwhile, half a world away from Kasserine, factory whistles blew at Springfield and Winchester to mark the start of another shift. Assembly lines carried receivers slick with oil across workbenches, cutting dies, spitting sparks as fine as dust. The production boards in each shop ticked upward daily, over 4,000 rifles a day in 1943. A shift foreman tapped the completed column with his finger and tilted a smile. In America's defense industry, there was no such thing as not feasible. The desert night dropped quickly, like a dark blanket. In the prisoner camp, a broken voice in stiff English asked, "All? Like that?" The American soldier glanced at the interpreter, who nodded. Standard. The German prisoner pulled his head back slightly, standard, meaning not elite units, not a reward for expert marksmen. Simply every man. He looked down at his hands, joints still gritty with sand, as if even the act of believing, or not believing, was enough to dry the skin. At the front, the contrast only sharpened. American squads moved in small knots, each man a link in a chain of fire switching on and off with the rhythm of his right hand. German squads still had to anchor themselves on the MG, still had to manage the tempo of reloading belts, still had to wait for the arms working bolts, pull, push, lock, to finish. As the distance closed across the undulating desert terrain, the imbalance in firepower grew more stark. American tracers swept the ground ahead, making every decision to raise one's head a wager against time. In the end, the North African reports reached the archives. The cover page read, "The Americans may be equipping their forces with semi-automatic rifles on a large scale." A note in the margin added, "Cannot be verified as the required industrial capacity is beyond reasonable estimate." Cautious words, conditional phrases, but the writer had never seen the factory gates swing open each morning, nor heard the whistles that blew 3 times a day. The story from the desert had passed through many hands, then been set aside. But war does not forget. On a grey morning by a cold shore, where sand rose in slopes before the gun emplacements, that truth returned. The sea reeked of salt and fuel smoke, and the doors of landing craft swung open like iron lids. American figures poured onto the beach, crouching low, running, falling, rising again. And then the sound the desert had already foretold. At Omaha, the German positions looked down. They had prepared for the bang-pause-bang of bolt-action rifles, calculating the gaps in which to raise their sights. But from the sloping beach, the rows of Americans lifted their rifles, pressed stocks to shoulders, and did not stop. Chains of fire stitched evenly across the sand, sealing every opening, pinning down every head that dared rise. Captured German reports after the battle recorded what they were forced to admit. American infantry maintains continuous rifle fire while advancing. No pause observed for bolt operation. Volume of fire exceeds that of machine gun positions, dry words, but the beach itself explained why. The rhythm of fire never broke. There was no metallic scrape of a bolt pulled back and slammed forward, no lull in sound to signal an enemy sniper it was safe to lift his head. Only the light jerk of a shoulder and the occasional sharp ping, followed by the press of a fresh clip, the bolt snapping shut and the stream of fire beginning again. From above, the Germans realised that every calculation built on bolt-action timing had just been crushed on the spot. When the hedgerow country opened behind the beaches, the war changed its voice. No more 300-metre lines of sight. Instead, villages, tree lines and tangled thickets turned ranges under 100 metres into the daily norm. The realm where the KAR98K had once been trained to shine, distance, sight adjustment, steady breathing, no longer had a stage. At every wet bend in the lane, at every shattered gate, American squads closed quickly. They no longer waited for a single gun to open fire while the others held their breath. The Garand let each man carry his own machine gun. One German platoon tried an ambush in a narrow gap between hedgerows. The plan was simple: let the Americans walk into the net, fire a few sharp bursts, then slip away. But when the first man squeezed the trigger a second time, his hand was already reaching for the bolt. In that rhythm, the hedge ahead burst with sparks, short, rapid, precise shots driving them all into the mud. At that distance, the delay of manual action was no minor flaw. It was the open door through which enemy bullets poured. In July 1944, a captured German airborne training manual spelled it out. An American rifle squad creates firepower equivalent to a light machine gun position, standard suppression tactics ineffective. The phrasing was clipped, cold, like a prohibition. For the writer, it was not just a technical adjustment, It was an admission of disadvantage. Every American soldier was a complete unit of firepower. The bocage tested nerves more than muscle. Rain fell, mud clung, and the haze of powder smoke hung heavy among thick hedgerows. The US Army pushed forward metre by metre under a simple discipline: fire, move, fire, leaving no gaps. German squads, tied to their MG-centred rhythm, had to find ground to set up tripods, drag belts, and assign men to guard the gun. Each of those steps demanded time. The bocage gave no time. When they were finally ready, the semi-automatic volleys were already there, pressing the earth up against their boots. There were damp afternoons when village lanes turned to brown slush, and American soldiers pressed against stone walls, hearing their own breath under steel helmets. From across the way came the first German bursts, sharp, scattered. They pushed their Garands around the edge of the wall, answered with short streams, then slid across to the other side. Smoke blurred the air, but the rhythm of fire held steady, like a factory line reduced to two hands. On the other side, a German tried to fire again, his bolt fouled with mud, the metal scraping faintly, too long to turn the fight back. The contrast showed in every detail. After-action maps were crowded with short arrows. No sweeping arrows spanning whole fields, only tight strokes connecting hedgerows, corners, walls. Each arrow marked one burst of cover with the Garand, one push forward, another cover, another advance. Captured German reports repeated a single word: continuous. It was that continuity, not flashy on paper like the name of a weapon, that tripped their ambushes, raids and retreats again and again. Normandy taught the full lesson that the desert had drafted. Modern weapons went hand in hand with modern organisation. And as the damp summer gave way, the war crawled northeast into cold forests and roads coated with ice. The Normandy summer closed with rain-soaked hedgerows. Winter opened with ice-laden pines and darkened roads. On the map, German arrows suddenly converged, then drove deep into the Ardennes, an unexpected assault, often 3-1. Thin lines bent back, but on an icy ridge, Elson-Bourne Ridge, the advance struck something not in the plan: a wall of fire. December 17th, 1944. Wind cut across their faces. Dry snow crunched beneath boots. Along the line of the 99th Division, small squads pressed to the forest's edge, burrowed into hardened banks of snow. When the grey coats of the Germans broke into view, the entire line rose at once. The crack of fire ran straight and even, like a factory assembly line carried to the front. Just keep firing, reload, then fire again. The Germans couldn't get through the wall of lead, a sergeant of the 99th recalled in an after-action interview. The words were spare, undramatic, but on the churned snow one could picture it. Every yard of ground pinned under overlapping bursts of fire. Opposite them, the German spearhead stopped short as if hitting glass. They lacked no courage, they lacked room to move their heads. Each time a helmet tilted upward for a glance, the American semi-automatic rhythm answered with 3-4 more shots. The formation flattened, men tripping over one another, breath smoking white in the frozen air. KAR98K riflemen struggled for a second shot, lift, pull, push, lock, gun oil thickened below zero, heavy gloves slowing fingers by half a beat. In that delay, sparks leapt from the American trenches, pressing hot blood back into the ice. In the early days of the campaign, Berlin rejoiced at surprise. But as the advance ground on, captured orders grew heavier with warning. Every American position must be treated as an automatic weapons nest. Not MG-42s, not fixed emplacements. Each man with an M1 Garand. The adjustment on paper was clear, but no paper could help a platoon cross open ground when faced with that steady curtain of fire. On the ridge, the wind shifted. An American squad emptied its clip, the dry ping ringing against wool gloves. Numb hands still pressed a fresh clip down, the bolt snapped shut, The stock slid back into a frozen shoulder. They did not need to strip gloves to work the action. They did not need to lift their heads to hunt for a bolt in the snow-blind air. Across the line, a German soldier fumbled for a new stripper clip, counting rounds with fingers that no longer felt. His bolt dragged heavy as if weighted, the metal squealing in the cold, cut short by another burst slamming into his breath. At times, the fog was so thick that sound replaced sight. German squads groped forward along black tree lines, attempting leapfrogs, one team dashing, the other covering. In theory, it was correct. But Elsenborn Ridge gave no time for bolt-action covering fire. What they needed was continuity. What they had was punctuation. In each movement, the pause between German shots opened just wide enough for the Garand to close with 2-3 sharp cracks. The Americans wasted no words. They followed the sequence: suppress, move, suppress. Their fire was not dense in the sense of wasteful volleys. It was even. Every rise of a helmet met with a patter of short, precise bursts that drove knees back to ice. That steadiness, the emblem of Springfield's assembly lines, was now the pulse of a thin defensive line. In sectors where the odds ran 3-1, steadiness replaced numbers. Reports back to German headquarters changed tone. Approach difficult. Enemy fire does not cease. Staff officers marked alternate paths through the woods. But whether circling or charging, the problem remained the same. To move, you had to rise. To rise, you needed a pause in enemy fire. The Garand offered no pause. Even when the clip rang ping, the gap was no longer than a breath, not enough for a desperate decision. By dawn, the wind eased. Across the ice, footprints lay tangled atop each other. On the American side, .30-06 casings gleamed half buried in snow. On the German side, bolt handles scarred with frozen oil left scratches on steel. The contrast required no further words. As supply convoys rumbled up the ridge, a slate-grey sky began to spill fresh snow. And in its scramble to patch the breach, Germany would bring the G-43 to the front as its reply. But it was a reply too late and bitter. After Elsenborn Ridge in Berlin, heavy doors opened for a project that carried great hopes, the Gewehr 43. It was introduced as the rival to the Garand, a belated key meant to open a door that had already closed in the depths of winter. The test range smelled of fresh oil. On the bench lay the black frame of the G-43, its sight edges still sharp. An engineer explained the semi-automatic mechanism to a cluster of officers. One shot fired, the next round chambered automatically. The cycle ran on its own. They nodded. This was exactly what they had needed in the Ardennes. But the crack of a test shot was always smoother in the firing hall than in the woods. When the rhythm quickened, the bolt carrier began to hesitate, casings ejected unevenly, the trigger scraped with an unpleasant drag. A technician shook his head softly, smoothing the edge of the metal with fine sandpaper as if coaxing a stubborn child to run in a straight line. In the factory, another problem was waiting. The G-43 did not follow the path of Springfield's assembly line. It demanded craftsmanship more than machinery. Each component had to be fitted carefully, every small tolerance requiring an experienced eye. With bombs falling, production lines dispersed, and skilled workers scarce, each rifle leaving the shop carried its own risk. Production ledgers showed numbers that refused to climb. Through the war, only about 400,000 to 413,000 rifles could leave the benches. Across the ocean, Garand production had already passed 5,468,772. A ratio of roughly 13.6 to 1 was no abstract figure. It was the distance between an intention and a reality that never kept pace. The battlefield exposed the cost of arriving too late. A German team lay in wait at a forest edge. When an American patrol appeared, a soldier raised his G-43, held his breath, and fired the first shot. Good. He pressed for rhythm. The second shot jammed, the casing wedged crooked in the chamber. His gloved hand fumbled at the handle, muttering curses lost in the cold air. A comrade had to cover, but cover with a bolt action meant a gap between shots, just enough for the enemy to throw fire into the space. The ambush sank into mud. In retreat, the soldier clutched his G43 like an unkept promise. Rear echelons received many G43s with slips of paper attached. Frequent jams requires repair. The frontline armourer quickly became an invisible bottleneck, replacing springs, smoothing slides, polishing, testing, then returning the rifle with a hesitant nod. The gun might run for 2 or 3 clips until cold mud or powder fouling changed its mind. Some units began issuing the G43 only to designated marksmen, men who had time to nurse a fickle mechanism, because it could not be entrusted to every infantryman the way the Garand could. Meanwhile, squad doctrine still revolved around a central machine gun. The G43 was present, but never in numbers large enough to alter the structure of firepower. It was like a new note inserted into an old score. To rewrite the score, you needed an orchestra and the industry to build one, not a few scattered instruments. The contrast stood bare when the G43 was set beside the Garand. On one side, every part of the M1 was interchangeable. Break a piece, replace it, and the rifle ran smooth again. On the other, the G43 was like a watch that required every gear to be hand-set, half a millimetre off, and the rhythm failed. On one side, assembly lines swallowed receivers like grain and spat out uniform rifles for every soldier. On the other, craftsmen strained to patch the flaws of a system too small to grow. Internal paperwork revealed the frustration. Ordnance reports noted low reliability, urged constant maintenance, called for more spare parts. But spare parts were also numbers in supply tables, and those tables were shrinking under bombs, blackouts, and steel shortages. Each new directive to increase production struck the wall of reality. Dispersed workshops, undertrained labour, patchwork quality control. On paper, the Gewehr 43 remained the answer. In the field, it was only an answer too late. For when an army tries to catch up with a single rifle, while its opponent has already changed its organisation, training, production and logistics, that effort becomes nothing more than the drawn-out note of a song that has already fallen out of time. From January to May 1944, the slopes around the monastery at Cassino became the stairway of a relentless struggle. The US 34th and 45th Divisions climbed over jagged rock, traced dry gullies, circled machine gun nests hidden in olive groves. Everything the officers had once believed on their maps, that high ground, long fields of fire, and the chance for the KAR98K to display its accuracy, was suddenly warped by bends where no line of sight stretched more than 15 metres, cliffs that shattered every aim, and dead zones that appeared and vanished with each step. In the milky fog, an American squad pressed their backs to the rock. The lead man thrust his barrel past the edge, his Garand cracking 2 short shots, then the second man surged forward, 2 more. They climbed that way, shot, step shot, trading places in constant rhythm. Above them, a German paratrooper crouched behind a crevice, aiming downward. He squeezed the KAR98K's trigger. The first shot true, the second required pull-push lock. In that pause, sparks leapt from the opposite rock face, driving him flat into the gravel. German officers had once declared, "The mountain is the marksman's ally." They were not wrong if the mountain allowed time to prepare, to shift position, to read the wind. But Cassino allowed no such pauses. The trails crossed sharply, the cliffs formed narrow arenas where suppressive fire decided who climbed to the next step. Each bend was a contest of speed. Whichever side maintained a steady stream of short bursts seized the edge. There were places where Germans managed to set up an MG to hold the approach. When the MG roared, the entire slope lay flat. But whenever the gun needed a new belt or the terrain proved too tight for a tripod, the KAR98K had to reclaim its role of covering fire. And at Casino, covering with a bolt action was like holding back a flood with loose planks. The water surged through the very gaps of the mechanism. The Garand did not cover with a solid wall. It covered with rain, showers of small, steady drops that made each step forward safe. After weeks, the maps were bristling with coloured pins. Americans marked the stair steps they had taken with short slashes, each slash a corner cleared by Garand fire. Germans noted withdrawal routes, positions where MGs could be mounted, and spots they could not cross because they never managed a second shot in time. Both sides were exhausted, but only one side held in its hands the technology that allowed exhaustion without breaking rhythm. As rain blurred the monastery's outlines, the metallic clink of an empty clip dropping echoed again somewhere. Small but steady, like a clock reminding that another minute had passed. Casino did not grant quick glory, it eroded. And in that erosion, machinery that handled the next step by itself proved stronger than machinery that relied on a hand to make up the difference. Conservative thinking on one side demanded the mountain favour the perfect shot, reality demanded a stream of fire, and reality, as always, chose the victor. If even the high mountains could not save the KAR98K, and belated attempts like the G43, then what terrain could? To the north, the snow was returning, and the lesson of the rocks, leave no gap, would sound again, colder, sharper, in a place where winter showed no mercy. The clip's sharp ping on the Italian ridge faded into the mist. Elsewhere, no loose rock, no smell of powder, only shift whistles and harsh white lights. Another rhythm was continuing that same story. The steel gates of Springfield Armory swung open, the morning wind ran down long rows of buildings, and the assembly lines lit up like a river of metal. It was here that what the rocky slopes had been forced to admit was forged into reality. Organizational intelligence and technology could be multiplied at scale. Special jigs carried each receiver through more than 1,000 operations, each step removing a piece of handwork and replacing it with repeatable precision. In 1940, an M1 cost 117 labour hours to make. By 1943, that fell to 75, by 1945 to just 31 hours. Along with that, the unit cost slid from $83 to $31 per rifle, the kind of difference the front understood immediately when a squad needed to swap weapons as fast as it swapped magazines. On the pale yellow floor tiles, a hooded worker stood at a reaming machine. A man with goggles inspected rear sights. A gloved hand tightened the screws on a bolt assembly. Many of them had never touched a lathe before the war. They were trained fast. Learn one operation, then repeat that operation with hairline precision. By June 1943, women made up 43% of Springfield's workforce. 5,210 of 12,095 people. Hands that once threaded watch springs now held calipers, read numbers, and mark OK on parts that would run smoothly in mud, sand, and freezing weather. An hour passed, and the scoreboard ticked up another 164 rifles, the cadence of January 1944, when Springfield reached 122,001 rifles in a single month, about 3,936 rifles per day. That number did not stand alone. Up north, Winchester added 513,880. In the Midwest, a tractor maker, International Harvester, retooled to produce 337,623. Then Harrington and Richardson contributed 428,600. Springfield closed the account at 4,188,669. Altogether, roughly 5,468,772 M1s rolled off the lines. The crucial point was not merely many, it was absolute interchangeability. A bolt assembly taken from the parts bin would fit any rifle and run smoothly. At the front, that meant an armourer could fix a rifle in minutes, not hours. In the rear, it meant jigs and tolerances were enforced like a vow, something German technical reports had to admit they could not reproduce under their conditions. Across the line, German workshops bore the war's cracks, roofs shredded by bombs, factories dispersed, spotty power, interrupted steel supplies. Labour requisitioned or coerced did not produce the skill of trained machinists. It produced parts that had to be hand-fitted, demanding a craftsman at every stage. So, although the G43 was semi-automatic on paper, it could not generate a stable series of functioning rifles in the field. A G43 cost about 350 Reichsmark, many times the price of an M1, and costliest of all because that price did not buy reliability. Meanwhile, the M1's organisational intelligence extended beyond the rifle itself. It pulled ammunition and spare parts along in step. The Lake City plant turned out billions of rounds during the war. In 1945 alone, transport networks pushed 20 million rounds a day to Europe. At the far end, supply sergeants opened wooden crates, the smell of oiled paper strong, counting .30-06 clips, like counting the minutes of survival. The distance between need and have was shortened by rails, ships and trucks, and by unambiguous supply tables. A US soldier carried 80 rounds as a baseline, and behind him lay a resupply stream that was not cut off. All of it assembled into a visible method of war. Training built around the M1, from marching fire films to FM 7-10, 1944. Squad organisation that did not revolve around a single barrel. Manufacture aimed at interchangeability. Logistics designed to sustain a firing rhythm. The frontline soldier had one job: keep the trigger rhythm, the rifle fired, be ready to fire again. The rest, from screw to cartridge, was managed by a vast machine. It was more than a rifle. It was the weapon of industrial democracy, an engineering idea multiplied by organisational intelligence, common hands, and scale large enough to alter the outcome of a war. The freight cars loaded with wooden crates rolled out of Springfield into the morning mist. Across the ocean, as the smoke of war began to clear, so too did words left unsaid in the thunder of battle finally find their way to the surface. At interrogation tables and in memoirs, Germans began piecing together the last fragments of a picture they had once dismissed. They had underestimated American weapon technology and paid the price. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring wrote plainly, without evasion, "Every American soldier had a firepower advantage that could not be overcome. Our tactics became meaningless when they fired 8 rounds to our 1. The words were dry, but they amounted to surrender before the arithmetic of firepower. All the diagrams of advance and withdrawal, the lessons on shifting lanes of fire, shattered when the interval between enemy shots all but disappeared. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded in the Ardennes, did not try to excuse it either. We could not generate enough suppressive fire with the KAR98K. He understood that the problem lay not in courage or discipline, but in mechanics and firing rhythm. When the Garand turned every American infantryman into a self-sustaining point of fire, all their calculations built around the machine gun as a centerpiece collapsed. In makeshift prison camps in North Africa, and later in Normandy, many German POWs were stunned to hear that the Garand was standard issue. They had assumed it was a privilege of elite units. When the truth emerged, some gave a hollow laugh. They had fought for years on a false premise. Others, when assigned to use captured enemy rifles in desperate situations, admitted they actually preferred the Garand to their own G43. Not out of curiosity, but because it fired when it needed to fire, and it kept firing when it needed to keep firing. Their quiet regret was not complaint. It was closer to the feeling of a mechanic watching an engine hum smoothly after once scoffing that it could never be mass-produced. They realized that organizational intelligence and industrial discipline across the ocean had done one simple thing they themselves had overlooked. The best weapon must belong to every soldier. From those confessions, post-war Germany understood it could not return to bolt-action rifles as doctrine. In building a new army, they abandoned the old illusion of the perfect shot as the center and followed the path of the semi-automatic. The story was not over. In its final chapter, that legacy would take shape, a world of weapons redefined by one small but decisive sound, the ping. The confessions closed in black ink, but war does not end with words, it carries on through new choices. From the regrets of the defeated, another order took shape. Follow the rhythm of continuous fire. In World War II, historians searched the numbers to hear the guns. John Ellis, in The Sharp End of War, estimated that if the Garand had been replaced by bolt-action rifles, US infantry losses might have risen by about 40%. A dry statistic, but behind it were very specific moments. A squad crossing open ground because 3 trigger pulls landed at the right time. A group holding a bocage hedge only because the Garand erased the gap between shots. A thin line in the Ardennes that stood firm, not because it had numbers, but because it had rhythm. Every percentage point represented lives not lost. After the war, the Garand followed American soldiers to a colder peninsula, where the east wind cut across rocky slopes, Korea. There, human wave assaults tested the endurance of its rhythm. US troops held ridgelines with short bursts, fire, reload, fire again, just as they had done in Europe. Waves of men surged forward and broke apart under the rain of bullets, each gap closed by a ping and a new clip pressed in. The Garand was no miracle. It simply did the old job in a new place, giving time to those holding the line, stealing time from those attacking it. In Europe, the nation that once dismissed the impossible reached the opposite conclusion. When West Germany rebuilt its army, the Bundeswehr, in the 1950s, it did not return to the bolt-action rifle as a stubborn symbol. They chose semi-automatics for their infantry, acknowledging a lesson written in sweat and blood. Every soldier needs a mechanism that delivers the next round instantly, without waiting for the hand to intervene. The door once closed in Berlin reopened, but this time it led to a different workshop, where stream became the standard and dot became only a rare pause. The Garand's legacy does not lie in what it resembled afterward. It lies in the idea that everything after it had to pass through. Germany's STG-44, born at the war's end, carried the philosophy of controlled high rates of fire at close and medium range. The Soviet AK-47 inherited the spirit of giving firepower to every soldier. America's M16 went further, balancing weight, rate of fire, and accuracy. An entire line of modern rifles appeared, each a different variable in the same equation, putting seamless fire into the hands of the many. From that, a standard emerged and never left. Every soldier has a semi-automatic or automatic rifle. Infantry doctrine rewrote its tables. Advance, suppress, move, suppress, no longer tied to a single gun. Training manuals shifted their order. With movement came trigger rhythm. With dispersed formations came dispersed firepower. The rear shifted too. Production and supply had to sustain rhythm, not just numbers. Each rifle became a mobile unit of industry, where ideas, steel, factory sweat, and disciplined repetition converged. The Garand also left behind a way of telling the story of war. It showed that the battlefield is not decided only by grand icons, massive tanks, heavy artillery, but by small decisions repeated thousands of times a day. A trigger pulled in rhythm, a clip replaced quickly enough, a mechanism that did not force a soldier to wait. These small things, when gathered by organizational intelligence and guaranteed by technology, became a great capability. Years later, in a museum, an M1 Garand rests inside a glass case, its dark wood gleaming under golden light. The guide does not raise his voice. He simply locks a clip into place, tugs lightly, and lets it spring free. The sharp ping rings out like punctuation. Children stop. An old soldier closes his eyes, a thin smile on his lips. In that fleeting sound are the bocage, the bitter wind of Elsenborn, the sweat of training fields, the factory whistles at Springfield. A small sound, but one that shaped how the world came to understand infantry firepower. When the glass case shuts, the story remains open. Technology will continue to change. Doctrine will continue to adapt. But the core lesson the Garand left behind does not grow old. Put the best technology in the hands of every soldier and build an entire system to ensure it never loses rhythm. In the century of assembly lines, that is how industrial democracy turned an idea into power, from factory floor to foxhole, from one ping to a victory. The Garand did not just win a war, it proved that when intellect, technology and people align, military legend has to rewrite itself.